Responsibility did not arrive in my life as something imposed. It arrived as praise. It was wrapped in words like dependable, mature, and strong, spoken often enough that I began to believe they described who I was rather than what I was being asked to do. Over time, responsibility became the way I was seen and the way I learned to measure my worth. I noticed needs before they were voiced. I stepped in before problems escalated. I adjusted my expectations so others would not have to confront theirs. None of this felt like exploitation at first. It felt like love expressed through effort. The shift happened quietly, almost invisibly. What began as helping slowly transformed into covering. What began as support became assumption. Bills were left unpaid, not because someone forgot, but because they knew I would notice. Tasks were left unfinished, not because they were impossible, but because my reliability had become predictable. I absorbed inconvenience after inconvenience, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself fairness would eventually be restored. But fairness requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement never came. Exploitation rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with cruelty or raised voices. It settles into routine. It hides inside phrases like, "You re better at this," or "We couldn't manage without you." Over time, my willingness to hold things together became the very reason others felt free to let go. The imbalance did not shock me because it had been normalized through repetition. Each small sacrifice felt insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern that drained me slowly and thoroughly. What made it difficult to recognize was that I had consented, at least on the surface. I said yes. I stepped up. I filled the gaps. But consent shaped by expectation is not freely given. I had been taught that refusal was selfish, that boundaries were a sign of weakness, that my role was to stabilize rather than question. Responsibility was never shared equally because it was never framed as shared. It was framed as mine. The realization did not come with anger. It came with fatigue, a deep, settled exhaustion that did not lift with rest. I began to see how often my needs were postponed indefinitely, while others' needs were treated as urgent, how my discomfort was minimized while theirs was protected, how I was praised not for being whole, but for being useful. Responsibility had stopped being a choice and had become an obligation enforced through silence and expectation. What hurt most was not the imbalance itself, but how invisible it was to those who benefited from it. They did not see exploitation because they did not experience loss. They saw stability and assumed it was natural. They saw consistency and mistook it for abundance. My effort made their lives smoother, and smoothness rarely inspires reflection. As long as things worked, there was no reason to ask how or at whose expense. When I finally paused long enough to look at the full picture, the truth was unavoidable. Responsibility had been redirected away from those who avoided it and placed squarely on me because I had proven I would carry it. My reliability had been converted into entitlement, my silence into permission. The system functioned because I did not disrupt it. Naming this truth was not an act of bitterness. It was an act of clarity. I understood then that responsibility without reciprocity is not virtue. It is extraction. Care without consideration is not love. It is convenience. And strength that is only valued when it serves others is not strength at all, but survival. Recognizing exploitation did not require confrontation. It required honesty. Honesty with myself about what I had accepted and why. Responsibility should be shared, chosen, and respected. When it becomes expected, uneven, and invisible, it stops being a reflection of character and becomes a quiet theft of time, energy, and self. This understanding marked the beginning of my refusal to continue carrying what was never meant to be mine alone. Writing. ID equals 69,427. Variant equals standard. The truth did not arrive in a dramatic moment or through a confrontation. It revealed itself quietly, through numbers on a screen and documents left without explanation. At first, it felt like routine maintenance, the kind of task I had done countless times before, checking accounts, reviewing statements, making sure everything was in order. I had always believed that staying on top of finances was part of being responsible. What I did not realize was how carefully the disorder had been hidden behind my consistency. As I moved from one transaction to the next, a pattern began to surface. It was not one large expense that raised alarm, but the repetition of small ones that told a deeper story. Charges that were meant to be shared appeared solely under my name. Transfers that were assumed to have happened simply had not. Bills listed as split evenly carried no record of repayment. Each discovery was subtle enough to dismiss on its own, but together they formed a map of imbalance that I could no longer ignore. There was a moment when I stopped scrolling and simply stared at the screen. Not in shock, but in recognition. I had seen this before in other areas of my life, just not in numbers. The same assumption that I would handle it, the same quiet confidence that I would absorb the difference. I had trusted that fairness existed because I believed in it, not because it was being practiced. The financial truth was not sudden betrayal. It was prolonged reliance disguised as partnership. What unsettled me most was how long this had gone unnoticed, not because the information was hidden, but because I had not questioned it. I had told myself stories to soften the reality, that things would balance out later. That temporary hardship explained the gap. That caring meant stepping in without keeping score. These explanations had protected others from discomfort while slowly eroding my own stability. The truth was not that I had been careless. It was that I had been accommodating to my own detriment. As I continued reviewing the records, my understanding deepened. Expenses tied to convenience rather than necessity had been placed on me without discussion. Subscriptions, deliveries, shared services all flowed in one direction. The system worked because I worked within it without resistance. My financial reliability had become infrastructure. Invisible, expected, and unacknowledged. There was no anger in that moment. Anger would have implied surprise. What I felt was clarity sharpened by fatigue. The numbers did not accuse. They simply reflected what had been happening all along. They showed me how responsibility had been transferred quietly, month after month, without consent or conversation. The absence of communication was itself the confirmation. If fairness had been intended, it would not have required my silence to function. The realization extended beyond money. It forced me to reconsider how often I had been positioned as the solution rather than a participant. Finances were just the most tangible evidence of a deeper pattern. When I was capable, others felt less compelled to be accountable. When I managed quietly, imbalance flourished unnoticed. The financial truth exposed the emotional one. I had been valued for what I could sustain, not for what I needed. What made this discovery difficult was not the loss itself, but the understanding of how intentionally ordinary it had been. There was no urgency to fix what only I was paying for, no incentive to rebalance a system that functioned smoothly for everyone else. The truth was never meant to shock me. It was meant to remain buried under my tolerance. Seeing it changed something irreversible, not because I felt wronged, but because I could no longer pretend I was mistaken. The numbers told the story without interpretation. They showed me that I had been financing stability for others while slowly compromising my own. That knowledge did not collapse me. It steadied me. It gave shape to feelings I had struggled to articulate. Discovering the financial truth was not the end of trust. It was the beginning of self-respect. Family loyalty was never presented to me as a choice. It was framed as a duty, something inherited rather than agreed upon. From an early age, I learned that being loyal meant staying quiet, being flexible, and absorbing discomfort without complaint. The word loyalty carried warmth in its sound, but in practice, it functioned more like a rule. It determined who was allowed to need more and who was expected to give more. I was taught that love within a family meant endurance, not balance. Over time, loyalty stopped being an expression of care and became a justification. It was used to excuse behavior that would not have been tolerated outside the family. Broken promises was softened by reminders of shared history. Unequal treatment was reframed as understanding. When boundaries were crossed, loyalty was invoked as a reason not to question it. The expectation was clear even when it went unspoken. Family came first, which quietly meant that my needs came last. What made this dynamic difficult to recognize was how normalized it felt. Loyalty was praised when it benefited others, never when it protected me. I was admired for being dependable, for not causing conflict, for stepping in when things fell apart. That admiration carried an unspoken condition. As long as I remained useful, I was valued. When I hesitated or questioned the imbalance, loyalty was used to remind me of my role. Love, in that context, was conditional. It required compliance. Permission replaced consent in subtle ways. Decisions were made with the assumption that I would agree. Responsibilities were assigned without discussion. My time, energy, and resources were treated as communal property simply because I belonged to the family. When I felt discomfort, I was told to understand. When I expressed exhaustion, I was reminded of obligation. Loyalty was no longer about mutual support. It had become a mechanism that allowed others to take without asking. The most painful part was not the taking itself, but the lack of recognition. There was no gratitude that matched the sacrifice, no acknowledgement of the weight being carried. Loyalty was expected, not appreciated. It was referenced only when it was needed to maintain the existing structure. In moments when I needed support, loyalty was suddenly abstract. It became something I was supposed to embody, not something I could receive. I began to notice how often love was spoken about in terms of what I could tolerate rather than what I deserved. Care was measured by endurance. Affection followed accommodation. When I complied, harmony was preserved. When I resisted, I was accused of breaking the family bond. The irony was that the bond was already one-sided. Loyalty had been defined in a way that required my silence to survive. Understanding this did not turn love into resentment. It clarified what love was not. Love does not require erasure. It does not ask one person to shrink so others can remain comfortable. Loyalty that depends on imbalance is not loyalty at all. It is permission disguised as virtue. Permission to overlook harm. Permission to avoid accountability. Permission to continue patterns that benefit some at the expense of another. Letting go of this version of loyalty was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of honesty. I realized that staying loyal to a system that consumed me was not noble. It was unsustainable. True care allows space for boundaries, for refusal, for individuality. When loyalty is used to justify taking without giving, it stops being love. It becomes a quiet contract where one person pays the cost so others never have to. Recognizing this truth allowed me to step away without hatred and without guilt. Finally understanding that love without permission to remain whole is not love at all. The moment did not arrive with final words or dramatic resolve. It came quietly, in the space between a message received and a response never sent. Guilt had always been my reflex. It rose automatically whenever I considered stepping back, as if responsibility were wired into my nervous system. I had been trained to feel discomfort not when I was wronged, but when I imagined disappointing someone else. Silence felt unnatural at first, like withholding something I owed. For years, guilt had been the language through which expectations were delivered. It rarely sounded harsh. More often, it arrived wrapped in concern, in reminders of family, in subtle suggestions that I was the one who could fix things. Guilt kept me accessible. It ensured my compliance without requiring explanation. I responded before I reflected, acted before I questioned. Silence threatened that structure. It introduced uncertainty where there had always been control. When I chose not to reply, I noticed how quickly guilt tried to fill the gap. My mind offered familiar arguments. They need you. You are being selfish. This will cause damage. These thoughts had guided me for so long that they felt like truth rather than conditioning. But underneath them, something else was present. Exhaustion, a clarity that did not demand action. For the first time, I allowed that feeling to exist without rushing to erase it. Silence was not passive. It was deliberate. It required me to sit with discomfort instead of resolving it for others. Each unanswered message challenged a belief I had carried since childhood, that my value was tied to responsiveness, that love depended on availability. That peace could only be maintained through sacrifice. By choosing silence, I disrupted a cycle that had relied on my participation. The absence of my voice revealed how much weight it had been carrying. Messages continued, framed as concern, then urgency, then disappointment. The tone shifted, but the expectation remained the same. I was supposed to return to my role, to smooth things over, to make the tension disappear. My silence made it clear that guilt alone could no longer move me. That realization unsettled me more than their words ever had. What surprised me was how silence began to feel less like withdrawal and more like protection. Without constant engagement, my thoughts settled. I could tell the difference between responsibility and obligation, between care and coercion. Guilt lost some of its power once I stopped feeding it with immediate reactions. I began to see how often it had been used to override my boundaries before I could name them. Choosing silence did not mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped performing care at my own expense. I understood then that guilt had been a substitute for consent. As long as I felt guilty, I would comply. Silence interrupted that transaction. It returned agency to me in a way no argument ever could. There was no statement to refute, no emotion to debate, just the quiet presence of my decision. In that quiet, I felt something unfamiliar but grounding. Relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I was no longer betraying myself to keep others comfortable. The guilt did not disappear immediately. It surfaced in waves, each one weaker than the last. And each time, I let it pass without acting on it. The moment I chose silence was the moment I chose myself. Not aggressively, not defiantly, but firmly. I stopped explaining. I stopped justifying. I stopped absorbing emotions that were not mine to carry. Silence became a boundary that did not require defense. It marked the end of a pattern that had depended on my willingness to feel guilty for wanting peace. Leaving did not come from anger, and it did not require hatred to sustain it. For a long time, I believed that walking away had to be fueled by resentment or justified by outrage. I thought distance meant punishment, and that separation required emotional violence to make it feel valid. What I learned instead was that leaving could be quiet, intentional, and rooted in clarity rather than blame. When I decided to step away, there was no dramatic final conversation, no list of grievances laid out for validation. I had spent years explaining myself, and each explanation had been reshaped to fit someone else's narrative. This time, I understood that understanding was not something I needed to earn. I was not leaving to make a point. I was leaving to breathe. Hatred would have kept me tied to what I was trying to release. It would have required me to stay emotionally engaged, replaying old moments and justifying my decision over and over. I did not want to carry them with me into the life I was building. Choosing not to hate was not forgiveness in the traditional sense. It was refusal. Refusal to let bitterness become another obligation I had to maintain. Reclaiming my life began with small, almost unremarkable choices. Waking without bracing myself for conflict. Making plans without anticipating how they would be received. Spending money without calculating how it might be needed elsewhere. These moments were quiet, but they were profound. Each one returned a piece of autonomy that had been eroded over time. I began to experience my life as something I inhabited, not something I managed for others. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly, not to provoke anger, but to test my resolve. I would remember situations where I had been dismissed or overlooked, and the old reflex to justify myself would rise. Instead of pushing it away, I acknowledged it and let it pass. I did not need to relive pain to honor the decision I had made. The truth did not require repetition. What surprised me most was how grief and relief could coexist without contradiction. I mourned what I had hoped for, not what had actually been there. I let go of the idea that leaving meant failure or abandonment. Sometimes departure is not rejection, but recognition. Recognition that staying costs more than leaving ever will. As I rebuilt my life, I noticed how different it felt to be treated with mutual respect. Conversations did not revolve around obligation. Support did not come with conditions. I I was not praised for endurance or silence. I was valued for presence. That difference reshaped how I understood love. Love that requires self-erasure is not love. Love that survives only through sacrifice is not sustainable. Leaving without hatred allowed me to keep my integrity intact. I did not need to demonize anyone to justify choosing myself. I accepted that people can cause harm without intending to, and that intention does not negate impact. Walking away was not about assigning blame. It was about accepting reality without negotiating my worth. Reclaiming my life did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, through routines that became grounding and choices that felt increasingly natural. I stopped measuring my decisions against past expectations. I stopped anticipating approval that would never come. The space I created was not empty. It was full of possibility. In the end, leaving was an act of self-respect, not defiance. It allowed me to step forward without carrying resentment as baggage. I did not need hatred to justify my freedom. I only needed the courage to choose a life where I could exist fully, without apology, and without abandoning myself to maintain peace.